All right, so I'm doing the props versus state quiz on Scrimba, and I kind of just wanted to explain some of the differences between props and state inside of React. So a prop is basically a property that we pass through a component. So an example of this would be here in our form. Nope, let's go to our main. A prop would be something like this. So inside of our header, if we wanted to pass in some props, we would go ahead and say header, and then here we would say item1, and then we would equal it out to, let's say, something called item1. And now this is a prop or a property. And if we go inside of our header.jsx and we console.log our props.item1, what we'll notice is that we should get back the value of our npm, or our value of our prop that we just passed, or of item1. So if we go here, we get back item1. That's not what we wanted to get back. Oh, it is, because we logged out item1. We could do something like test, and when we log it out, we get test. And that is a prop or a property. And in the same way, a property is almost like a function parameter. We can compare that to a regular function parameter. So an example would be a function that adds two numbers. So I could say add two numbers, a and b, and then I could return a and b. So the same way, we wouldn't want to change the value of a property or a parameter in a function within the function body is the same way I would never want to go to my header and then let's say my props.item1 and equal it to, like, let's say something. So we would never want to change our prop like this. And the reason why is because then the data doesn't really, make sense. So if I had multiple of these header.jsx files or instances inside of our main.jsx, like let's say I had 3 of these, and each of them had a different item1 prop, it wouldn't really matter because we just changed it to a hard-coded value by saying props.item1 equals something. And it kind of works the same with a function. So I would never want to take a function, like let's say add two numbers and then the parameters of a and b, and equal the parameter of that function to something else like 42. Because then when we use the add two numbers, instead of getting 3 here, we would actually get 44, and that's not what we want. And it works the same way in React. So we would never want to change the property or the props of a component within the actual function or component itself. We would only want to change it inside of an instance. So when we call it inside of our main.jsx, we could change it as many times as we want in here and it wouldn't really matter. So that's kind of the difference between, or that's kind of how a prop works. Now state is different. So state basically refers to values that are managed by the component. And anytime we have changing values that we need to display, we're basically going to be using state. So if props are the data that a component is receiving from above, so remember our function props, from above just means from our props parameter inside of our component, and it shouldn't be changing. States are like values defined within the body of the component, so not through the props, but within the body of the component. And those are things that should be changing. So an example of this is if we have a function called greeting and we have the parameter of name. We should never go name equals Nelly. We should never do that. We should never change that. But if we were to declare different variables, like let's say time of day, we could change that as many times as we want, and it would not affect our function. In the same way, if we had something like time of day here, and we just equaled it out to an if-else statement, it would not affect our props if we change the value of time of day 100 times. It wouldn't matter. So basically, that's kind of how a state is. So we can change the value that we basically put inside of our functions. So like const day equals new day hours, and then let time of day. We change this 4 different times, but it doesn't affect our prop or our parameter in the function. And the function will still work exactly how we need it to work. So we will still get the name of Bob, and instead we'll get the time of day equals these different values. So this kind of makes it almost like a feature. So depending on the time of day, we'll get good morning, good night, etc., etc. So this is just an example saying we would never want to change the parameter. And in React, in the future, I don't think we are going to take any prop and change it within the component like this, because it wouldn't make sense. Instead, our values are probably going to change depending on its state. So if we had, let's say like time of day is probably going to be different states. I'm not entirely sure yet because I haven't learned the concept, but I'm sure these will be different, almost like states. And you can actually do state management in JavaScript. So I want to bring that example up real quick. Because I have done it before. So Java. Okay. So want to show how to change state in regular JavaScript. So if we go here, we learn about reducers, understand state and state management. So it works a little bit different in JavaScript here. I just want to go down to where I was actually doing it. So the way that state management worked in JavaScript was basically through an if-else statement. So I don't really remember I remember doing this, but basically this function called checkAuth is basically going to take our state in vanilla JavaScript, and it is a function. Notice here how we don't have a parameter, and instead inside of our checkAuth we have a user that equals to true. And if the user is true, the user message is going to be welcome back. Otherwise, the user message is going to say you must sign in, and it'll be red. So this is basically our state, because our state is either going to be you must sign in or welcome back. So either authenticated or not authenticated. And that's kind of how state would work inside of JavaScript or vanilla JavaScript. So another thing is that we could use state objects to declare the important data. So we can use this dot state, and this is using this dot because we're working in our class components or our classes. And we can say is auth is false and error equals blank. And the way we would want to change our state is immutably, or meaning we don't want to change the original. So we would use basically the array literal syntax to go ahead and take all the values, so spread in all the values of our old state, and then just modify our new state. And this will basically just clone this dot state and put it inside of a new object and give it back to us. So we don't want to ever change state like this. And I'm sure it'll be very similar in JavaScript. And I don't know how much sense that made, but I kind of just wanted to go over that. So back to the quiz here. So how would you describe the concept of state? The way I would describe the concept of state are values that are within a component that can be changed, or basically values that are inside of a component that have changing values that should be displayed to our users. So for example, let's say something that should be changing is the time of day. That would kind of be like a state. So when would you want to use props instead of state? I think we would basically use props instead of state when we don't need the values to basically change. So like in our card component, or in our last project, we were using a external data file like this. We would never need to change any of these values because these values are already hard-coded within the data file itself. So in that instance, we would just use props instead of state. When would we want to use state instead of props? I think we would want to use state instead of props when we actually want to go ahead and change something. So in our meme generator, when we want to put text on the top half and on the bottom half, I think that's when we would want to use state instead of components. We don't want to hard code these two text fields or these two pieces of text that are going to be here. Another time we would want to use state is when we want to add an item. So we want to change the state and we want to update that so we see thing 3 down here. What does immutable mean? Are props immutable? Is state immutable? So immutable just means not having the ability to change. So are props immutable? That's a good question. Let me think. Props do have the ability to change, but only from the instance or the declaration of its component. But otherwise, props aren't really immutable in the sense that we can't go down here and just say props dot, let's say item 1 equals changed. So you would never want to do this, making it kind of immutable. And is state immutable? So obviously state is not immutable because it's something that changes. So if we wanted to change the state of, let's say, the time of day, it would be changing. So it would mean that it's not immutable. So that's pretty much it for these questions. I think I answered them pretty well, but that's it.